They said humanity had no place among the stars. We were too soft, too fragile, too prone to breaking under pressure. When the Galactic Council first encountered us, they cataloged our species with clinical detachment, average lifespan of 80 solar cycles, brittle calcium-based skeletal structure, susceptible to radiation, requiring constant atmospheric regulation, and fatally vulnerable to most known toxins in the galaxy. We were a curiosity at best, a liability at worst. But they made one critical error in their assessment. They measured our bodies and forgot to account for our minds. They counted our weaknesses and ignored our greatest strength, the stubborn, reckless, beautiful human refusal to accept limitations. While other species saw obstacles, we saw puzzles. Where they found impossibilities, we found engineering challenges. And when they laughed at Lieutenant Sarah Chin's experimental armor on the day she deployed to the contested moon of Krell 9, they had no idea they were about to witness the moment everything they knew about warfare would change forever. This is the story of how one soldier, one impossible piece of technology, and one desperate battle rewrote the rules of engagement across 17 star systems. This is the story of the day they stopped laughing. The transport shuttle rattled as it descended through Krell 9's upper atmosphere, and Sarah Chun gripped the safety harness across her chest with both hands. Around her, the other members of the expeditionary force sat in their standard-issue combat gear, their faces masks of professional calm. Sarah looked down at her own equipment and felt the familiar heat of embarrassment crawl up her neck. Her armor was different. Dramatically, obviously, impossibly different. Where the other soldiers wore the sleek, proven designs of the Galactic Defense Force, all sharp angles, and matte black plating, Sarah's armor seemed to have been assembled by a committee of engineers who couldn't agree on anything. It bulged in strange places. Panels covered in unusual markings dotted the surface. The whole thing had an organic quality that made it look almost alive, like some kind of technological parasite wrapped around her body. Worst of all, it was covered in what looked like sensors and receptors, giving her the appearance of a walking pincushion. "Hey, Chun," called out Corporal Vri, a Thalaxian whose purple skin gleamed in the shuttle's dim lighting. "Did you get lost on the way to the experimental weapons testing facility? Because I'm pretty sure this is a combat deployment." Laughter rippled through the transport bay. Sarah kept her eyes forward, jaw tight. "Leave her alone," said Lieutenant Kale, though his own mandibles clicked in what Sarah had learned to recognize as Zinthari amusement. Earth's military has always been creative with their solutions. Remember the duct tape incident? More laughter. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. The duct tape incident had occurred 3 months ago when humanity's chief engineer had temporarily repaired a critical hull breach using what he cheerfully called the most versatile substance in human history. It had worked, which somehow made it even more embarrassing. "At least duct tape is useful," said Vri. "That armor looks like it was designed by someone who'd never seen combat before. What's it supposed to do? Intimidate the enemy with its ugliness." "It's a neural interfacing responsive combat system," Sarah said quietly, finally breaking her silence. "It's designed to adapt to threat environments in real time using predictive algorithms and biofeedback integration." The transport bay went silent for a moment. Then, Vri burst out laughing, slapping his scaled thigh. "Did you hear that? It's got a fancy name. I've got a fancy name for my weapon too. I call it the gun that shoots things. Seems to work pretty well." Even Lieutenant Kale couldn't suppress his amusement this time. "With respect, Chun, every species in the Coalition has tried to develop responsive armor systems. The processing requirements are beyond current technology. The lag time between threat assessment and response makes the whole concept impractical. That's not an insult to human engineering. It's just physics." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to defend the 3 years of development and testing that had gone into this system, wanted to explain how Dr. Yuki Tanaka's team had solved the processing lag problem using quantum-entangled processing cores that operated outside normal space-time constraints. But she knew how it would sound. Humans were the new kids in the galactic community. They'd been part of the Coalition for less than a decade. Every time they tried to contribute something innovative, they were met with patient smiles and gentle corrections from species who'd been traveling the stars for thousands of years. So Sarah said nothing. She just sat in her strange, bulky armor and endured the knowing glances and barely suppressed laughter of her fellow soldiers. The shuttle touched down on Krell 9's surface with a heavy thud that reverberated through the hull. Outside, through the small viewports, Sarah could see the moon's rust-colored landscape stretching to a horizon that seemed too close, a reminder of the small world's weak gravity. In the distance, the ruins of the Krell civilization jutted up like broken teeth, dark and foreboding against the pale orange sky. "Listen up," Lieutenant Kale said, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter as the rear hatch began to open with a pneumatic hiss. "Intelligence suggests the XA-3 have established a forward operating base somewhere in the ruins. Our job is to locate it, assess their numbers, and report back. This is reconnaissance only. We are not, I repeat, not engaging unless absolutely necessary. The XA-3 have home field advantage here, and they outnumber us considerably." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. The XA-3 were one of the Coalition's primary adversaries, a hive-minded species that viewed all other sentient life as resources to be consumed. They were fast, vicious, and utterly without mercy. Every soldier in the Coalition had heard stories about XA-3 ambushes, about entire units that simply vanished into their tunnels, never to be seen again. "Chun," Kale said, looking directly at her, "you'll be taking rearguard position. If your armor malfunctions, I want you back on this shuttle immediately." "Understood, sir." "The armor won't malfunction," Sarah protested. "It's been through rigorous testing." Kale's mandibles clicked again, this time in what Sarah recognized as the Zinthari equivalent of a patient sigh. "I'm sure it has. But this is your first real combat deployment, and that's experimental equipment. I'm not taking chances with my people's lives." "Rearguard position. Confirm." "Confirmed, sir," Sarah said, hating how small her voice sounded. The squad filed out of the shuttle in practiced formation, weapons at the ready. Sarah took her position at the back, feeling the armor settle around her body like a second skin. For all the mockery it received, the armor was remarkably comfortable. The neural interface created a direct link between her nervous system and the suit's various systems, making it respond to her intentions almost as quickly as her own body would. Almost being the key word. Lieutenant Kale was right about one thing. Traditional responsive armor systems had always suffered from processing lag. By the time the armor's computer detected a threat, analyzed the optimal response, and implemented that response, the enemy had usually already landed their attack. It was a problem that had plagued military engineers across a dozen species for generations. But Dr. Tanaka had approached the problem from a different angle. Instead of trying to make the processing faster, she'd made it predictive. The armor didn't wait to detect threats. It constantly monitored Sarah's biosigns, her hormone levels, her neural patterns, even the minute movements of her eyes, and used that data to predict what threats she was unconsciously perceiving before her conscious mind had even registered them. It was reactive armor that reacted before there was anything to react to. In testing, it had been almost spooky how well it worked. Sarah would think about reaching for her sidearm, and the armor would have already adjusted the holster angle for optimal draw speed. She'd notice a target in her peripheral vision, and her helmet's HUD would have already highlighted it and calculated firing solutions. It felt less like wearing armor and more like having a hyper-competent battle partner who could read her mind. Of course, that had all been in controlled testing environments. This was real combat. Sarah tried not to think about all the ways the system could fail when lives were on the line. The squad moved through the ruins in tactical formation, with Kale at the point and Sarah bringing up the rear. The ancient Krell structures loomed around them, their purposes long forgotten. Some were barely taller than Sarah, while others stretched 10 stories high, their surfaces covered in what looked like circuit patterns carved directly into the stone. The Krell had been a technological species, the archaeologists said, one that had achieved a remarkable integration of organic and synthetic systems before mysteriously vanishing 3,000 years ago. Sarah's armor suddenly went warm against her skin, a sensation like stepping into sunlight. Her HUD flickered, and new data began streaming across her vision. Threat assessment algorithms activated without her input, scanning the ruins around them with unprecedented detail. "Chun, are you getting interference on your equipment?" Kale's voice crackled through the comm system. I'm reading some kind of energy fluctuation from your position. Sarah checked her readouts. Negative, sir. All systems nominal. But, even as she said it, she could feel the armor doing something, processing something, its quantum cores humming with activity. The Krell ruins around them seemed to light up in her HUD, highlighted in colors she couldn't quite name. They pressed deeper into the ruins. The squad moved past buildings that might have been homes or factories or temples, their true nature unknowable. Occasionally, they'd see Krell artifacts lying in the dust, strange tools with too many handles, sculptures of creatures that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions, fragments of technology that still hummed with residual power after 3 millennia. Sarah's armor was getting warmer. The humming was intensifying. Something was happening, something the designers hadn't anticipated. The quantum cores were processing vast amounts of data, pulling information from sources Sarah couldn't identify. Her HUD was filling with tactical information, showing her optimal paths through the ruins, highlighting cover positions, marking potential ambush points. Contact, whispered Sergeant Drax, a massive Corvin whose species was prized for their exceptional hearing. Movement, 300 meters, multiple signals. The squad immediately took cover positions. Sarah pressed herself against an ancient wall, feeling her armor shift and adjust, hardening on her exposed sides while maintaining flexibility in her joints. Through her HUD, she could see what Drax had heard. Thermal signatures, dozens of them, moving through the ruins in the distinctive scuttling pattern of Exithrine warriors. Too many, Kale muttered. We need to pull back, get to the shuttle, call for reinforcements. But, as he spoke, more signatures appeared on Sarah's HUD, these ones behind them, cutting off their retreat. They were surrounded. Ambush, Vree hissed. They knew we were coming. Kale's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of serious stress in his species. All units, defensive positions. Chun, get on the comm and call for. He never finished the sentence. The Exathrine attacked. They came from everywhere at once, erupting from the ruins like a wave of chitin and claws. Exathrine warriors were nightmarish creatures, all segmented bodies and blade-like limbs, their movements impossibly fast and utterly coordinated. The squad opened fire, their weapons lighting up the dim ruins with pulses of energy, but for every Exathrine that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. Sarah raised her weapon, her hands shaking, trying to acquire a target in the chaos. She'd trained for this, had spent months on the firing range and in combat simulations, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of it. The sounds, the smells, the visceral terror of watching her squad mates fight for their lives against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. A Exathrine warrior broke through the line, heading straight for her. Sarah froze, her finger locked on the trigger, unable to move. This was it. This was how she died, wearing her experimental armor that everyone had laughed at, having never even fired a shot in anger. Then, her armor reacted. It happened faster than thought. The armor didn't wait for Sarah's conscious mind to process the threat. It detected the spike in her adrenaline, registered the dilation of her pupils as they focused on the attacking Exathrine, measured the minute tensing of her muscles in preparation for fight or flight. And, in the nanoseconds before Sarah's conscious mind could even scream, the armor had already acted. Panels on her forearms snapped open, and, suddenly, she was firing weapons she hadn't even known were there, small directed energy emitters that caught the Exathrine in mid-leap. The creature's exoskeleton burst into flames, and it crashed to the ground at Sarah's feet, twitching, and then, still. Sarah stared at the smoking corpse, then, at her arms. The panels had already sealed again, leaving no trace that they'd ever been there. What the hell was that? Vree shouted from across the ruins. Chun, what did you just do? But Sarah couldn't answer because 2 more Exathrine were coming at her, and this time her armor was already moving before she even saw them. Her legs pushed her to the side without her input, dodging a clawed strike that would have disemboweled her. Simultaneously, her arm came up, and the armor fired again, catching one of the Exathrine in what might have been its face. The creature went down. The second Exathrine adapted, coming in low where Sarah's automatic targeting seemed weakest. But the armor was already adapting too, learning from each engagement. Sarah felt something shift on her back, and, suddenly, she was jumping, propelled by small thrusters that lifted her over the attacking creature. She landed behind it, spun with a grace she'd never possessed before, and put 3 shots into its back. Around her, the battle was going badly. The squad was overwhelmed, falling back toward a collapsed building that offered minimal cover. Sarah could see Corporal Vri go down, clutching a wound in his side. Sergeant Drax was bleeding from a dozen cuts, still firing, but clearly running low on ammunition. Chun, fall back, Kale ordered. Get to the shuttle, call for evac. But Sarah wasn't falling back. She couldn't. Her armor wouldn't let her. Because the armor had detected something Sarah's conscious mind hadn't. If she retreated, if she left her squad here, they would all die. The armor had run the probability matrices, had calculated the trajectories, had analyzed the XA3 attack patterns. There was only one scenario where the squad survived, and it involved Sarah doing the impossible. It involved her becoming what they'd all laughed at, a one-woman responsive combat system that could turn the tide of battle. Sarah felt her fear being processed by the neural interface, felt it being analyzed and categorized, and then filed away as irrelevant data. What remained was cold clarity, the kind of hyper-focused state that athletes described as being in the zone, but amplified 1,000-fold by the direct integration of her nervous system with the armor's quantum processors. She could see everything. Every XA3, every potential threat vector, every possible outcome spinning out in branching probability trees that her augmented mind could actually track and understand. The Krell ruins around her lit up in her HUD like a 3-dimensional chessboard, showing her exactly where to stand, where to move, where to shoot. Sarah stepped forward into the swarm of XA3, and her armor made her something more than human. Panels opened across the suit's surface, revealing weapons systems that Dr. Tanaka's team had integrated but that Sarah had never seen activated. Micromissiles launched from her shoulders, each one finding a target with impossible accuracy. Energy weapons in her forearms spat coherent light that cut through XA3 chitin like paper. Some kind of sonic emitter in her chest plate sent out a pulse that caused 3 attackers to stumble, their coordination disrupted. But the most impressive thing wasn't the weapons. It was how the armor moved her. Every dodge, every turn, every step was perfect, optimized not just for her survival, but for maximum tactical advantage. The armor positioned her so that the XA3 couldn't surround her, so that each enemy blocked the line of attack of another, so that she was always exactly where she needed to be. To the watching squad, it looked like Sarah was dancing through the battlefield, an impossible ballet of violence that left XA3 corpses in her wake. To Sarah herself, it felt like being a passenger in her own body, watching in awe as the armor and her unconscious instincts worked in perfect harmony to accomplish things she'd never dreamed possible. A XA3 warrior larger than the others, clearly some kind of leader, charged directly at her. Sarah's armor responded by lifting her off the ground with her back-mounted thrusters, flipping her over the creature's head while simultaneously firing downward. The XA3 leader collapsed, its central nervous system severed. The tide of the battle shifted. The XA3, having lost their leader and faced with an enemy that seemed impossible to kill, began to retreat. They scattered into the ruins, disappearing into holes and tunnels that Sarah's HUD tracked but didn't follow. Within minutes, the battlefield was clear except for the bodies of the fallen XA3 and the shocked faces of her squad. Sarah stood in the center of the carnage, her armor cooling down around her, weapons retracting back into their concealed panels. The quantum cores quieted, and Sarah felt the strange hyper-aware state fade, leaving her feeling oddly empty, like waking from a vivid dream. "What?" Vri said, his voice barely above a whisper as he clutched his wounded side. "What in the 17 hells was that?" Lieutenant Kale approached slowly, his weapon still raised, but his mandibles hanging open in what Sarah recognized as profound shock. "Chun, your equipment specifications said nothing about that level of integrated weapon systems. That wasn't standard coalition defensive technology. That wasn't standard anything technology." Sarah wanted to explain, wanted to describe how the armor worked, but she was shaking now, the adrenaline crash hitting her all at once. She'd just killed She'd killed dozens of living creatures. Yes, they were Xa-3. Yes, they would have killed her and her entire squad without hesitation. But they'd been alive, and now they weren't, and Sarah had been the one to end them. "I need to sit down," she said quietly, and her legs gave out. The armor caught her, supporting her weight, lowering her gently to the ground. Even now, it was taking care of her. Sergeant Drax came over, his massive frame blocking out the pale orange sun. His species wasn't known for showing emotion, but his voice was gentle when he spoke. "You saved us, Chun. We'd all be dead if not for you, and that armor." "They laughed at me," Sarah said, and she wasn't sure if she was talking to Drax or to herself. Everyone laughed at the weird armor, the experimental equipment, the human military trying to punch above its weight class. "I'm not laughing now," Vree said. He'd managed to stand, one hand still pressed to his side where a temporary medical seal was staunching the bleeding. "Nobody's laughing now, Chun." Lieutenant Kale was already on the comm, calling for emergency evac and reporting what had happened. Sarah could hear him struggling to describe what he'd witnessed, could hear the disbelief in the voice of whoever was on the other end. How could they believe it? How could anyone believe that a single soldier in experimental armor had turned back a full Xa-3 ambush force? But they'd seen it. They'd all seen it. As they waited for evac, Sarah sat on the rust-colored ground of Krell 9, surrounded by the bodies of her enemies, wearing armor that had transformed her into something beyond human, and tried to process what had just happened. She'd gone into this mission as a joke, the laughingstock with the weird equipment. She was leaving it as something else entirely. She just wasn't sure yet what that something was. In the ruins around them, the ancient Krell structures hummed with their residual power, their circuit-like patterns glowing faintly in the dimming light. And if Sarah had been paying attention to her HUD in that moment, if she hadn't been lost in her own thoughts, she might have noticed something strange. The patterns of those ancient ruins perfectly matched the data streams that her armor had been processing during the battle. The Krell weren't as dead as everyone thought, and they just made contact with something they'd been waiting 3,000 years to find, a species capable of true neural technology integration, a species that could finally unlock what they'd left behind. But Sarah didn't notice. Not yet. She just sat there, shaking, while around her the squad that had laughed at her armor now looked at her with something new in their eyes. Something that might have been respect, or fear, or possibly both. The evac shuttle arrived 20 minutes later, its landing thrusters kicking up clouds of rust-colored dust. As Sarah walked up the ramp, supported by Sergeant Drax because her legs still weren't entirely steady, she caught sight of her reflection in the shuttle's polished hull. Her armor was covered in scorch marks and Xa-3 blood. The strange organic-looking panels had visible battle damage. But it was still functional, still sealed around her like a second skin, still humming with whatever quantum processes powered it. And for the first time since she'd put it on, Sarah didn't feel embarrassed by how it looked. She felt grateful. Whatever this armor was, whatever Dr. Tanaka had created, it had saved her life and the lives of her squad. That was all that mattered. As the shuttle lifted off from Krell 9's surface, Sarah watched through the viewport as the moon fell away beneath them. Somewhere down there in those ruins, the Xa-3 were regrouping, analyzing what had happened, trying to understand how they'd been defeated by a single opponent. And somewhere else in those ruins, ancient Krell technology was humming with renewed purpose, responding to the activation of protocols that had been dormant for 3 millennia. The galaxy was about to learn that humans brought more to the coalition than duct tape and stubborn optimism. They brought innovation that didn't respect the established rules. They brought solutions that ignored the boundaries of what was supposed to be possible. They brought armor that reacted before the threat even arrived. And that was going to change everything.